Have you ever experienced the feeling of driving your car home after a long day of work, parking it, taking the keys out of the ignition, and then walking away, never to return to it? If not, you're just like most people. Not everyone thinks the same way, though. Some people seem to abandon their vehicles wherever they like. And to make matters worse, they often abandon truly beautiful and unique cars when they're doing it. Every single car you're about to see has been used, abused, and discarded. But they all have a story to tell. This poor old 1950 Chrysler Imperial Sedanca DeVille has seen better days. The images you see here were taken at the historic festival at Lime Rock Park in Connecticut in 2017, which was the first time the car had an opportunity to be appreciated by a wide audience in years. To be more specific about it, it was the first time in just over 30 years. The Chrysler had been in the care of a local car dealership when the dealership went bust. Nobody ever took over the building the dealership was trading out of, and nobody ever came to reclaim the cars from behind it either. That meant it stayed in the grassy mudlands behind that store for 3 decades. To make matters worse, it was not just any old Chrysler. Its coachwork was done by Mexican coach builder DM Nacional, and the car is thought to be the last surviving example of his work. Someone should have been taking better care of it for that reason alone, but at least it's not past the point of being salvageable. Here's another Chrysler that's down on its luck. This one's a little newer than the one from Connecticut. It's a 1953 Chrysler Windsor Deluxe. Technically speaking, it isn't abandoned, it's just that nobody's paying any attention to its upkeep, and nobody's performed any servicing on it for a very long time. We're not 100% sure quite how long it's been locked up inside Tater's garage in the South Salem area of New York, but we know it's been at least 11 years. Apparently, the owner's waiting for a change in the market before selling it. Right now, there's a bigger market for 2-door Chryslers than 4-door Chryslers, and this one has 4 doors. That might be true, but couldn't it at least be sold to someone who'd care about it rather than keeping it hidden, unloved, and uncared for? This car definitely deserves better. If we asked you to guess when car manufacturers began to experiment with the idea of electric cars, what would your guess be? Somewhere in the 60s? Perhaps the 1950s at a push? Wrong. Think much, much earlier. Go all the way back to 1910. That's when this incredibly rare Detroit Electric Model D was built, and it's back up and running after spending years in storage after the museum that owned it forgot about it. The early automobile has a maximum range of 100 miles when fully charged, but it's only capable of 25 miles per hour at top speed. For a brief period of time in the early 20th century, electric cars like this were actually more popular than petrol-driven cars. It's only when petroleum models entered mass production in the 1920s that the switch in popularity happened. This model hasn't been modified or altered at all during its entire century-plus life, meaning it still has the same interior it was fitted with on the day it first rolled out onto the road. We'll introduce this next example of recklessly abandoned cars with a disclaimer. Nobody seems to be able to agree on whether they're real Formula One cars or replica Formula One cars. If they're replicas, they're the most convincing replicas we've ever seen. Thinking about it, a Formula One car is only useful for one season. As soon as the season is over, the team that built it moves on to the next season's model, and the old car is no longer required. They have to go somewhere, so it's entirely possible they could have been sold to a wealthy collector and then abandoned in France in a rusty heap. Perhaps the owner went bankrupt or passed away. Assuming they're real, there's some incredible racing history here. The cars are all from the 1980s and 1990s, and the Benetton model is the same as the one Michael Schumacher drove in 1993. It might even be his car. Eagle-eyed race fans might have spotted the Lotus and Ferrari racers that are gathering rust here alongside it. What a waste. The Lamborghini Miura is a car that's almost too beautiful for words, and abandoning one should be a criminal offense. We'll make an exception to that rule for this next story, though, because the abandonment was only temporary, and it happened by accident. The 1969 Miura P400S had spent a long and happy life with its owner in Germany until he passed away in 2015, leaving the luxury car stranded in a barn with only 18,000 miles on the clock. While the owner obviously loved it, he clearly didn't drive it very far, and he hadn't told anybody where it was. Somebody finally found it earlier this year and was amazed to discover that it had never undergone any restoration work and didn't need any. The Miura chassis 4245 still has its original paint job, still contains its 3.9-liter V12 engine, and still has its distinctive sky blue interior. It's not just a car, it's a time capsule that takes you all the way back to the end of the 1960s. No wonder it attracted a price tag of $1.6 million when it was auctioned off in October of 2019. This next car, a Bentley Flying Spur, has been abandoned in Dubai for so long that it's become something of a landmark for civilians. Many people have come to take pictures of it, but nobody's ever turned up to claim it. As a result, it has an inch-thick coating of dust that gets worse every month, and the tires have totally deflated. You might look at this and think it's just another example of someone in Dubai having more money than sense and treating their car with no respect. But that might not be the case. It's a criminal offense to get into debt in the country, so when citizens, and especially foreigners, are about to default on a credit payment, they often flee the country to avoid being charged or imprisoned for their misdemeanors. They can't take their cars with them on the plane, so they're forced to leave them behind. It's possible someone abandoned the Bentley because they don't care about it, but it's more likely that they defaulted on payments against it. If you ever find yourself driving along the roads of Montana in the United States of America and you come across the sight of rows of rusting cars along a riverbank, don't panic. You're not looking at the aftermath of an enormous road traffic accident. They're actually part of a well-meaning but poorly thought-out experiment from the 1950s. Back then, we didn't know as much about river erosion as we do now. People genuinely thought stripping the engines out of cars and shoving them down the riverbank would reinforce the bank. While it's true that in some cases the cars may have made the river more sturdy, such an approach would likely fall foul of health and safety regulations today. Although it started in Montana, the practice spread as far as Detroit, where it became known as the Detroit Riprap. Because cars disposed of in this way are prone to leaking oil, rust, and paint into the water, the practice is now prohibited. Nobody seems to want to come and tidy up the old mess, though. We've all heard of barn finds, but how about pond finds? We can't see the idea catching on. You have half a chance of a barn find being in good enough condition to restore and get back out onto the road. The same can't be said for a car that spent upwards of 15 years in a pond. Here's a tragic-looking 1959 Chevy Impala to prove our point. Only someone with unlimited money or 0 cents would deliberately use a classic car as a pond ornament. But to be fair to the last known owners of the vehicle, that was never their intention. The car was apparently ran into the pond of its own accord when it was parked, we suspect the handbrake was left off, and immediately flooded. The owner never bothered to fish it out again, and the next person to buy the property decided to keep the car there as a talking point. We suppose that means it isn't really abandoned, but we can't say we're okay with what's happened to it. There are 2 things wrong with this next set of images. Firstly, whoever owns this car can't drive. They've bought a $2 million Koenigsegg Trivita, and yet they've parked it cluelessly across 2 parking bays. The second thing is that, having parked it so badly, they've never come back for it. Who would leave such a valuable car abandoned like this? Did they have to run away from it in a hurry? Only 3 examples of the Trivita, which is based on the Koenigsegg CCXR, have ever been built. That makes it easy to track down the owner of this one. The car park is in Zurich, and we know that one of the 3 car owners is a Swiss businessman who lives in the state of Schwyz. His car doesn't appear to have suffered any material damage, and it's right where he carelessly left it. If he doesn't want to come back and claim it, he can at least sell it to one of the many people who'd love to own it. If you're someone who believes that supercars are nothing more than playthings for the rich, then the story of this 1925 Bugatti Breccia Roadster won't do anything to dispel those beliefs. You can see from looking at it that it's had a rough life, and that's because it spent 74 years at the bottom of Lake Maggiore on the Swiss side of the Swiss-Italian border. The car was built as a custom job for French racing legend René Dreyfus, who took great pleasure in driving it around the roads of the Alps at speeds of up to 100 miles per hour. Back then, that was an extreme speed. Dreyfus made the mistake of getting drunk and losing the car to Swiss millionaire playboy Adalbert Bodie in the 1930s. But Bodie never paid the tax on his acquisition. When presented with a bill in 1935, he sank it to the bottom of the lake in an act of petulance. It was 2009 by the time it was dredged back up again, and it's now been exported to California to become a museum piece. When the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren was first produced in 2003, it was one of the fastest supercars in the world. It's still considered very fast now, and this one could probably still reach 200 miles per hour if anyone ever came to liberate it from its long abandonment in Chechnya. Doing so might not be easy though. Nobody's looking after it, but right now, it technically belongs to the police. The supercar was seized in 2011 as part of a complicated inquiry into a car leasing company, and the case is somehow still held up in the Czech courts. Until it's fully resolved, the car can't be sold, moved on, or driven away. That means it has to be parked up and left alone. That's understandable. But what's less understandable is why it's been left standing in the elements when it could be in a nice, safe, warm garage where it won't degrade as quickly. The police should consider investigating themselves for the criminal treatment of a stunning car. There are some cars that just scream classy, and we count the 1939 Lincoln Zephyr Coupe among that number. There's nothing classy about leaving it in a barn for decades, but at least the fact that it was covered by a tarp has meant that it's in reasonable condition. There's no harm done to it that can't be repaired. The angular vehicle was considered superior to the Chrysler range when it was first produced, but today it's thought that less than 40 of them remain. That means that even with the rust and dust that this car built up during all the years it spent in the barn in Virginia, it's still extremely valuable to the right buyer. It still holds the same V12 engine that it was fitted with on the day it rolled off the production line. And incredibly, that engine still turns over, even if it isn't quite fit to run. After being recovered, the car was headed to auction, where it was hoped a buyer could be found to take it on as a restoration project. Let's hope that this is an abandoned car story with a happy ending. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.